audiences. The following program is rated TV MA LSV. It contains strong language, sexual situations, and violence. It is intended only for mature audiences.
Looking in a northwesterly direction towards the entrance of a three-level single-family residence. Vehicle license number 741 Nora Queen Victor, located in the garage beneath the residence at 8763 Wonderland. Camera's rolling. Now in the residence, the first level living room area wherein victim number 1 was found. Apparent blood splatterings are evident on the south and west walls and on the sofa located on the west wall of the living room. There is evidence of ransacking in this room. Apparent narcotics paraphernalia is evident on the coffee table directly above and to the northeast of victim 1. Victim's one's head is facing in a southerly direction. The body is partially covered by a pink and white checkered spread, covering the lower buttocks and down across the feet.
You wouldn't make a movie.
It would be about something different in my life. People wouldn't come and see me.
bending down onto the book upon the coffee table that appear to be straight down drops. Approximately.
What the Los Angeles police saw inside this house on the afternoon of July the 1st, 1981, made even the most hardened detectives shudder.
It looked as if someone had walked through the house with buckets of blood and just threw the buckets of blood everywhere, and that's pretty close. There's a lot of blood.
Inside, a scene of stark terror. 4 bodies, 2 women and 2 men, brutally beaten, their heads bashed in. A 5th victim found in a pool of blood barely survived, but couldn't remember, much less describe what she'd seen. One thing was certain. This orgy of violence was not the handiwork of a single man. The detectives knew that, but they didn't know it was a case that would eventually touch the lives of Liberace's lover, an adult film star, John Holmes. They also didn't know it would take nearly 9 years to bring the man they believed ordered the killing to trial.
The trail of broken lives that lies behind Mr. Nash has to end, and this has to end, and this has to be resolved. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm asking you to return guilty verdicts in this case, because all of the evidence has shown that he, in fact, is guilty.
With those words, the prosecution rested its case late last week against this man, reputed drug kingpin Adel Nasrallah, known as Eddie Nash.
Ed Nash, 1981, was a businessman in Los Angeles. He owned nightclubs. He was a good target. He had drugs. He had cash.
He also had a motive for murder. Prosecutors say Nash ordered the Wonderland massacre because he'd been robbed by some of the victims less than 2 days earlier.
I heard it. I saw it.
Within the dark and seedy underbelly of Los Angeles, a myriad of infamous events plagued the city's past, but one that may rival them all was the scene that unfolded on the early morning of July 1st, 1981, at 8763 Wonderland Avenue, a residence that would go down into the city's dark history. The home lay tucked up and away into the Hollywood Hills, more specifically, the mysterious in of itself Laurel Canyon, an enclave nestled right above the chaos and madness that was the Sunset Strip and Hollywood. A world in of its own, compared to the world below the hills, only a stone's throw away. And within Laurel Canyon and Hollywood's history, there was a gruesome event that would bring together famous, powerful, and notorious individuals together into a dark and twisted saga that would result in the destruction and death of 4 individuals' lives. A crime that would rock the city and the world, leaving its dark, lingering memories for the locals and those that remember to bear with forever. For an event with many moving parts and players at hand, for narrative's sake, and to keep things relative to the larger story, we'll be examining and focusing on the infamous figure that was John Holmes. John Curtis Holmes was an American adult film actor. He ranks among the most prolific adult film performers, with documented credits for at least 573 films. Holmes reached celebrity status through his work and was best known for his exceptionally large genitalia. He also went by the name at times Johnny Wad, the lead character he portrayed in a series of related films. Holmes was a prolific figure of his time who claimed during an interview segment that he had intercourse with over 14,000 women, with many friends and acquaintances that he met throughout his time of social climbing in Hollywood's seedy adult film and party scene. His eventual befriending and betrayal of his counterparts, all fueled and driven by a savage narcotic addiction, would eventually lead to the death of 4 individuals and the downfall of one of Hollywood's biggest players. John Holmes' early career after breaking into the adult film industry was one of hard work and persistence. A married man of the time, who believed it was his God-given talent and destiny to be an adult actor. Always seeking to be special and validated for his talents, he convinced his wife at the time, Sharon Ann, that this was his real calling, and this is why he was put on Earth. And to her surprise, he was right. John Holmes will go down in history as one of the, if not the, most famous and prolific adult film actors in history, with him reaching full mainstream celebrity status within pulp culture, with cinematographer Bob Voss stating, and I quote, "John Holmes was to the adult film industry what Elvis Presley was to rock and roll. He was simply the king," end quote. To this day, people remember the works of John Holmes, truly leaving his mark on the world, for good or for bad. After breaking into the industry and displaying his abilities, John became a superstar within the adult film industry, with directors fighting over getting to work with him. Money-wise, in his prime, he was earning over $3,000 a day acting in his roles, and working and acting in these films came natural to Holmes, who was said to be a diligent worker, not just when it came to intercourse, but he would help around the set with lighting, with sound, costumes, basically whatever needed to be done for the film, even staying after off the clock just to be around and work on the set. But this was the early Holmes, a driven and passionate, clean-cut, meticulous man who didn't do drugs or even drink. But just as quickly as the star that was John Holmes began to rise, the eventual fall and sunset over the Hollywood skyline would befall Mr. Holmes. The decline of the man came with what corrupts most men, especially one dead center in the heart of the bright lights and glitter-covered darkness that is the adult film industry and Los Angeles as a whole. Ego, lust, pride, greed. It's not that hard to corrupt an individual surrounded by the whirlwind. And although trying to maintain a semblance of a somewhat normal marriage with his wife, the hands of darkness had grasped hard on Mr. Holmes, leading him on a dark path of drug abuse and dependency. In late 1980, a mutual friend introduced Holmes to Chris Cox, who owned the Odyssey nightclub. In turn, Cox introduced Holmes to Eddie Nash. Who is Eddie Nash? Eddie Nash was born Adel Garib Nasrallah in Mandatory Palestine. His family were Orthodox Christian Palestinians from the city of Ramallah. Nash's family owned 48 hotels. In the early 1950s, Nash immigrated to the United States with only $7 after his family had lost everything in the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. In Los Angeles, he briefly found work as an actor and a stuntman, and was an expert horseman. In 1952, he appeared in a small role as the character named Nash in an episode of the Western series, The Cisco Kid. In 1960s, Nash opened up a hot dog stand called Beef Chuck's on Hollywood Boulevard, and by the 1970s, Nash had owned several nightclubs and restaurants in Los Angeles, such as the PJ's Club in West Hollywood, the Sold Out Club in Hollywood, the Odyssey Disco, the Paradise Ballroom, the Seven Seas, Alibaba's, and the Kit Kat Strip Club. Nash's clubs attracted diverse groups, as he operated clubs marketed toward gays, heterosexuals, teenagers, African Americans, and other target audiences. Nash was known to be a kingpin, a drug dealer, a shot caller, and a high roller. In a way, not your average street-level dealer, but a powerful and influential man within the city, well-respected and known, who many believe had international mob ties, being that he was so entrenched in the heart of the West Coast and familiar with the seedy and dark underbelly of Los Angeles. Even believed to be acquainted or friendly with Sirhan Sirhan of RFK notoriety, being that both were linked through their interest in horses and equestrianism. A man, to say the least, that had his finger on the pulse of the city, not a target that you'd want to attack, let alone disrespect or go to war with. As Nash naively befriended Holmes after meeting him through mutuals, Holmes, who at the same time was closely associated with the Wonderland gang, a group of heroin-addicted cocaine dealers who were deemed even too wild and too degenerate by their criminal peers, located on Wonderland Avenue, out of which they lived and operated. Holmes frequently sold drugs for the gang to make money and to gather drugs for his own use. The gang members included Ron Lanius, David Lind, and their wheelman Tracy McCourt, along with others. Holmes, who had stated previously, although an adult actor, had been dedicated to remaining clean-cut and of not drinking or partaking in drugs, now, a couple years later, has found himself in the grips of a severe drug addiction, having to resort to selling narcotics and homosexual interactions to fund his addiction, even been involved in a male-with-male film towards the end of his career. Holmes, after using more than his share of the Wonderland gang's drugs, found himself falling out of their favor, with the gang growing tired of Holmes for his debts that he owed. In June of 1981, he told Lanius and Lynn about a large stash of drugs and money and jewelry that Nash had in his house to appease them. Holmes helped them set up a home invasion and armed robbery committed on the morning of June 29th, in which Lanius, Devrel, Lind, and McCourt committed a brutal home invasion at the home of Eddie Nash, and resulted in Nash's bodyguard, Gregory Dials, being shot and injured, and Nash being threatened with death and humiliated. Following the attacks, Nash immediately suspected that John Holmes had been involved, as he had been at Nash's house 3 times on the morning of the attack, at which Holmes had left the sliding door open for the gang later to enter through. Nash sent Dials, his bodyguard, to retrieve Holmes for questioning. Dials supposedly spotted Holmes walking around Hollywood wearing one of Nash's rings and brought him back to the property. Scott Thorson, a former boyfriend of Liberace, who was in Nash's house to visit and to buy drugs, claimed he witnessed Holmes being tied to a chair and repeatedly punched, and his family threatened until he revealed the assailants' identities. Nash then dispatched his bodyguards and enforcers after gaining the information, and accompanied by Holmes, and went to exact revenge against the Wonderland gang for what had taken place. In the early hours around 4:30 a.m. on July 1st, 1981, 2 days after the robbery at Nash's home, an unknown number of identified men, accompanied by Holmes, arrived at the property. It's believed that Holmes knocked on the door of the house on Wonderland Avenue. Inside, having heard a familiar voice of Holmes, the gang opened the door unsuspectingly, only for a group of attackers to rush in and bludgeon Lanius, Devrel, Miller, and Barbara Richardson, Lynn's girlfriend, who had been visiting, with metal pipes and hammers. Richardson's bloody body was found on the living room floor besides the couch where she'd been sleeping that night. Miller was found on her bed, with Devrel at the foot of her bed in an upright position leaning against the TV stand. A hammer was found on the bed. Lanius was found beaten to death on his bed, with gravely injured wife Susan beside him on the floor. Both bedrooms had been thoroughly searched and ransacked. Despite suffering severe brain damage in the attack, Susan ultimately survived and recovered, but she was left with permanent amnesia regarding the night of her attack, and had to have part of her skull surgically removed and lost part of her finger. Neither Lynn nor McCourt were present during the attack. Lind was consuming drugs with a prostitute in a motel, and McCourt was at his own home. In total, 4 people were found murdered and a 5th severely beaten in the Wonderland Avenue home. Holmes was allegedly present during the beating and the murders and left a palm print over the victim's headboard, but it is unclear whether he actually participated in the killings, although it's widely speculated that he had. And although neighbors would later report having heard loud screams around 3 a.m., no phone calls were placed to the police until 4 p.m. on July 1st, over 12 hours later, when furniture movers working at the house next door to the crime scene heard Susan moaning and went to investigate. The house was notorious for round-the-clock mayhem and debauchery, and when questioned, neighbors said the Wonderland gang's drug-fueled parties often included loud, violent screaming and disruptive noise. So when they heard the murders occurring that night, they simply believed another party was taking place. Following the attacks and discovery of the bodies, Los Angeles Police Department detectives Tom Lang and Robert Souza led the murder investigation and searched Nash's home a few days after the crime. There, they found more than $1 million worth of cocaine, as well as some items stolen from the Wonderland Avenue townhome. An initial theory of the murder centered on Holmes. As his palm print was found, he was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder on March 1982. After a publicized 3-week trial, Holmes was acquitted on all criminal charges on June 26, 1982. As the only surviving victim, Susan, not being able to remember any distinguishing details of the faces or the men involved after receiving her attack. Holmes spent 110 days in jail for contempt of court for refusing to testify or cooperate with authorities, and shortly after the murders, in her first newspaper interview in July 1981, Holmes's first wife, Sharon Holmes, stated that he had told her he had known the people in Wonderland Avenue townhome, and he had been there shortly before the murders occurred. She did not divulge any additional information to the police. In April 1988, 1 month after Holmes' death, Sharon Holmes stated in an interview with Los Angeles Times that on the morning of the murders, Holmes had arrived at her house with blood splattered on his clothes, and recounted how he had led 3 thugs into the tightly secured drug house on Wonderland Avenue, escorted them in, and stood by as they bludgeoned the 5 people inside. She said Holmes never told her the names of the 3 other assailants. Holmes would later die on March 13th, 1988, from complications battling the AIDS virus.
Male sex film star of the 70s and early 80s made hundreds of sexually explicit films in his career. The Los Angeles Times recently reported that Holmes had contracted acquired immune deficiency syndrome and was hospitalized at the VA hospital in Sepulveda. Reports tonight say Holmes died just after 1 o'clock this morning. Holmes had been questioned recently about the 1981 bludgeon murders of 4 people in Laurel Canyon. Holmes refused to answer questions back then and was acquitted of the murders a year later. But a recent newspaper report said a new witness had surfaced and Holmes had been questioned on his deathbed.
In 1982, Nash was sentenced to 8 years in prison, but a judge released him after just 2, purportedly due to Nash's poor health. In 1990, Nash was retried in state court for having planned the murders. The trial resulted in an 11-1 hung jury. Nash would later admit that he had bribed the lone holdout, a young woman with $50,000. The retrial ended in acquittal. In a graphic excerpt, according to John Holmes' second wife, Lori, known as Misty Dawn, in a Playboy magazine interview, she says, and I quote, "He," referring to Eddie Nash, "was an awful, awful man. John told me he used to leave the bathrooms without toilet paper, then offer young women cocaine if they'd lick his ass clean," end I quote. Throughout the 1990s, law enforcement figures continued to hound Nash, who had been referred to in various print media as the one that got away. In 1995, in a broad series of raids targeting alleged organized crime figures, federal agents armed with search warrants raided Nash's house and confiscated what was believed to be a cache of methamphetamine, but would later prove to be just mothballs, and Nash again escaped punishment of any kind. In 2000, after a 4-year joint investigation involving local and federal authorities, Nash was arrested and indicted on federal charges under the RICO statute for running a drug trafficking and money laundering operation, conspiring to carry out the Wonderland murders, also bribing one of the jurors of his first trial. Nash, by this point, was in his 70s and suffering from emphysema and several other ailments. He agreed to a plea bargain agreement in September of 2001, pleading guilty to the RICO charges and to money laundering. He also admitted to jury tampering and to having ordered his associates to retrieve stolen property from the Wonderland house, which might have resulted in violence, including murder, but he denied ever having planned the murders that occurred. He also agreed to cooperate with law enforcement authorities, and in exchange, he received a 4.5-year prison sentence, including time had already served, and a $250,000 fine. Nash would live out the remainder of his life until August 9th, 2014, where Nash died at the age of 85. This case had it all. It encapsulated the dark underbelly of Los Angeles and goes down in the lore of the city, remembered by locals and pop culture. And by having such close proximity and infamy in Hollywood, it's no surprise that major movie studios and directors set out to tell their rendition of the dark saga that unfolded on Wonderland Avenue. With Boogie Nights in 1997, a film written and directed by Paul Thomas Anderson, is a loosely based adaptation following Mark Wahlberg, who plays a character based on the life and exploits of John Holmes. Also, you have Wonderland, a 2003 American crime drama written and directed by James Cox, a closer examination at the Wonderland murders as a whole, with Val Kilmer playing the role of John Holmes in this adaptation. This case was truly the perfect storm. To the public at large, when it comes to Los Angeles and true crime horrors of the past, many will remember and reference the Manson family murders.
We have a weird homicide.
In a scene described by one investigator as reminiscent of a weird religious rite, 5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Miss Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanski. Miss Tate, who starred in Valley of the Dolls, was 8 months pregnant and was found in a bikini-type nightgown with a rope around her neck attached to the body of a man.
2 bodies inside, 2 bodies outside.
But from the detectives that worked the case and media members involved, no case goes down in Los Angeles lore such as the Wonderland murders, and it'll forever be etched in the city's dark history.
This stretch of Wonderland Avenue as a friendly group of people.
July 1st, 1981, a gruesome crime scene.
For now, there is only one victim still alive who knows for sure what happened.
And then I watched the Wonderland murders on the news, and I thought,
guys, I just want to say a quick thank you to everyone out there. I appreciate all the support. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, give it a like, give it a share, whatever. It means a lot. Again, have a good one, much appreciated, and stay safe.